Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 14 of the Madvertising Podcast, a podcast that explores everything marketing, advertising, technology, and the intersection of all of those specializations. We talk about technology, creativity, and ideas to inspire you and help make your work just that much better. Today, we have Rachel Braun. She is a producer and researcher for tech and VC. She has her own startup. I will let her tell you a little bit about. And I'm super excited to have her. She's a prolific voice in tech, really interesting. All of her previous work in podcasts makes us think. So welcome to the podcast, Rachel. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So yeah, we'll start by letting you give just a brief intro as to who you are. I know you've done some exciting work in the past with people we all know. So do you want to just start there?
For sure. So my name is Rachel. I created Braun and Brains. I've never heard of it called a startup before, so that's pretty cool. But I started that a few months ago. It used to be the name of a podcast I had a long time ago, but now I do research, production, and media for VCs and startups. And before this, I was a producer at This Week in Startups, hosted by Jason Calacanis. And at the time, Molly Wood was also on the show. Both of them are great. And then before that, I was a venture capital fellow at Dynamo VC. So through all of that, I've been able to happily start my own thing. And it's been going great so far.
That's awesome. And you're super young to have done all of those things. I personally don't think age has anything to do with success in tech. But one thing I've noted is there's a stereotype, which I think is totally wrong, that says young people are lazy and entitled. I would never classify you as any of those things. Have you heard this as well? Like, what do you think's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a different way of doing things now. With every generation, there's going to be a different way of doing things. And as technology is like implemented more and more into my day-to-day, I even see myself, like I work from home and I'll go back home to my parents where my dad still works a 9-to-5 job. He works for the government. He goes to the office and I sit and I play on my computer all day in his eyes, right? So I'm sure from like an outside perspective, it does look a little bit different from what traditional work looked like even just a few years ago, especially with the pandemic kind of shifting how we like really go about those entry-level jobs in particular. Maybe entry-level people will be starting out and they have to go to the office or they're fully remote with a limited, eyes with their boss, which definitely doesn't give like the best reputation because you don't get to know your colleagues as well. And even going into the office, maybe you're a little bit more set aside from the rest of your colleagues if they're more senior and they get to work remote. So I think working has shifted a lot and remote work has definitely played a lot of opinions into that.
We agree fully. And one thing I think people get wrong when they say things like, oh, you have to go to an office to even learn as a young professional. I think that young people are digital first. I think they've had no problems learning online. In fact, probably a lot of their high school and college curricula was online, and they're smart enough to Google things, or smart enough to take a MOOC, a massive open online course on their own. They're smart enough to listen to podcasts and watch YouTube. And for digital work, I actually think the barrier, and you've talked about this on some previous podcasts, is to just ship stuff and to try things and iterate. And I think, Rachel, you said something really interesting about being a creator online, which a lot of people aspire to, not just young people, people of all ages suddenly, want to have a voice online for a variety of reasons. And you said something interesting. You said, it's great to be creative, but it's better to be consistent. And if you're consistent, you can sort of push your way through maybe not being the most creative person in the room, and that might not even matter.
Yeah, for sure. So I think at the base, I'm a creative person, right? But creativity and burnout go hand in hand a lot. And the thing that keeps me going is knowing, you know what, like I don't have to be creative every single day. I just have to be consistent. So I don't think there is like this lack of creativity that people have when they become consistent, but I think it almost gives you a little bit of leeway being in the mindset of, you know what, I don't have to be creative at every waking moment and posting, every single day. Some days it's just throwing something at the wall and seeing what sticks. So not that being creative isn't important, but I think burnout and creativity, like I said, are can happen, especially like with remote work, can happen a lot more frequently than people might know.
Yeah, I think the risk of burnout in remote work is the fact that it's the opposite of what a lot of people think. It's that you'll work too hard. You don't have a 9 to 5 day structure, so some people will just keep working, especially really ambitious people. And it's not, oh, they're at, they're taking a 3 hour lunch and having margaritas. It's more they're like still working at like 9 o'clock at night when they should be, watching Netflix or reading a book or something like that. And they haven't developed healthy boundaries.
Right. There's this thing called the Parkinson's law, and I'm sure I'm going to totally butcher it right now, but basically like your tasks fills up to the time allotted. And I think with remote work, especially, or working for yourself, whether that's in a WeWork or at home, I guess, if you give yourself the whole day to do a task, it will take you the whole day. But if you give yourself maybe time block or give yourself an allotted amount of time, a lot of times you'll be able to either get that task done quicker or move on to another task that you'll be able to have checked off your list. And I don't know if necessarily like remote work in this vein is like the answer, right? Because we do see a lot of people giving themselves the whole day to finish something and making you less productive, even though maybe you're working longer hours. I think for most people, remote work actually isn't like the number one thing that they should look at first, especially not for their first role right out of college. I happen to graduate in 2020, so I didn't really have that many options. But there's very few people where I think 100% remote, not working from a place like a co-working spot or somebody's office really benefits you because of that, that the way people's brains work where, okay, if I give myself, like I said, the whole day to do something, you'll take that whole day and you'll be working till 9 p.m.
That's interesting. So it's not about everyone seems to say it's about learning. You're saying, no, it's probably more about structure.
Are you talking about for your first role?
Yeah, for your first role.
I think there's not necessarily like a balance between that, but I think they happen simultaneously. So if you're learning something, for example, like in a classroom in a lecture where they're like, okay, put your phones away. All you can do is take notes with pen and paper. This is an hour-long class. A lot of times you'll be able to learn a little bit better than if you're maybe at home and your roommate has like TV on and you're a little bit more distracted. So I think by shortening up, like tightening up the schedule and giving yourself like that a lot of time to learn is super important. And with remote work, you're not really giving yourself a lot of time to learn. And I think that's really difficult, even if you're given something like an onboarding package or a video to watch. That doesn't have to be with your divided attention. Like, I feel like I'd be a little bit more pressured to be at least look a little bit more focused if I was in an office.
Yeah, I remember when we worked together last year. So just FYI, AdQuick sponsored, I think like 6 episodes of This Week in Startup last year. And the pace of content that y'all were shipping last year was just insane. And I think it was like a different episode every day, different subject matter, different guests. Like coordinating that is one thing, but then you got to actually come up with the content, make sure it's compelling. And I totally agree and can totally see how that opportunity to continue learning kind of shrinks on you when you kind of muddle it up with a bunch of stuff that you need to get done for your job. So like, how did you think about, like, how did you handle that? Given the insane amount of workloads that you had last year?
I definitely perform best in a learning by doing environment. So I worked under an awesome producer named Nick Calacanis, who, if you listen to the All In podcast, he's also the producer over there. And just being able to see him and his workflow and him allocating me tasks was incredibly helpful. And at the time, there wasn't too much created as like an onboarding document. It's at the end of the day, the podcast only had a few people working at it. So similar to a startup, you're not necessarily given. For example, I worked at Goldman Sachs for one summer as an intern, and the onboarding I think was like a week long. And I don't even know if I had like a day of onboarding at This Week in Startups. But just being able to see somebody complete their work and they say, okay, you see what I did today? I hope you were taking notes, and here's like a recording of me doing it. Take this with you, and this will be like your learning. So That's exactly what we did at This Week in Startups, and exactly what I did when I departed from my role. I recorded me doing tasks. And what I did is I made a loom of me doing the task. I created a Notion page, and hopefully whoever next comes into that role, if they haven't yet already, is able to go check out that information that I created and take that with them and run. But that's how I learn best, for sure.
So kind of tell us about the new thing. So is it like a fractional type setup? Who are the customers? Who are you working with? Kind of how do your previous experiences kind of like translate to what you're doing now?
For sure. So starting off right out of school, so I studied information sciences and technology, which is a really long way of saying computer science with no hardware, just software. So a lot of my peers went on to do things like cybersecurity, software engineering roles, things like that. And I knew I didn't want to do that. So after college, I did a venture capital fellowship. And between my gap of going to This Week in Startups after that VC fellowship, I continued doing marketing tasks for the VC named Dynamo, which I mentioned previously. And they're awesome. A part of my like VC tasks of that time were, okay, this is how like we are promoting our fund, right? And my gap between the two wasn't insanely long, but it was long enough where I kind of wanted to make some extra cash, continue working with the team. And when I was doing that, I realized, listen, this is something that doesn't take me a lot of time. It's something that I felt like I was naturally good at. And then when I got to This Week in Startups, I noticed those marketing skills kind of carried over to marketing the show. So it's always thinking, okay, we're putting this much effort into the back end of recording. After the episode is live, the work doesn't end there with the episode. Like, how can we continue to grow the podcast? Because at the end of the day, that's how is a huge way that we can get deal flow into Jason's fund, which was Launch. And that's how I kind of realized marketing, producing podcasts are a niche that I really like doing, especially in that VC and startup space. And then with research, production and research, if anybody's a producer, like I was on the show, that can mean a lot of things, but it meant I was researching something and writing for 2 or 3 hours a day about the latest in tech and VC. And in college, I did research for a PhD candidate in the engineering department, and he was blind. And basically, I had to do a bunch of research and write things down for him that I had no idea. Like, I didn't know what any of it meant. But it made me realize how much I loved research, because even though I had no idea what this incredibly smart person was looking into or what he was having me write down on pen and paper to give to his supervisor, it just kind of, it sparked a different part of my brain that wasn't really sparked in those coding classes. And those research skills from college definitely helped me out with writing the show every day. Moving forward to now, I'm able to do things like market for other VCs, market for other startups, and then internally, if they need help, a lot of times those marketing materials that I'm creating can also be used as research. So say there is a podcast episode that they created, a VC, a startup, whoever, and they're like, okay, we created this podcast. Can you make information that is more palatable to people so they'll be really interested in watching? Like this might be a little bit dull. And so I'll go learn a bunch about the industry that startup or VC is focused on and create content based on that during the launch of that episode. And so that research can be used internally, it can be used for marketing. And that's kind of what Braun and Brains does. It helps people market in the VC and the startup space, and it also does research. The biggest people that I've worked with for research, it's probably Google, which I can't talk too much about there. But and the smallest people I work with are probably in the VC space, just because of the sheer number of people that are out some funds.
Right on. Really quick before I hand it off to Adam for the next one, but when in working with Google, are you using Bard as part of your? I got to ask the AI question. So, are you using AI to help you with the research piece?
I do not use Bard. For some other people, though, a lot of copywriting, I actually use Chat. This is an interesting thing to even talk about. I was looking at how often I use ChatGPT, and I use it about 10 times a day for writing copy, which makes it so I don't have to hire. I do have one person that I've hired out some things part-time with me, but I think that is a huge way that I've been able to cut costs is having things summarized, having copy written. Obviously, I would never post something that's like directly off ChatGPT, but having things like summarized and having like that vague idea of what to post, or in terms of the summary, having like a really long article summarized in bullet point format is my favorite, which helps me save, like I said, a ton of time. I don't have to hire anybody. Big fan.
Yeah, we found it helpful internally for like just even digesting like 10Ks or 10Qs. It's like, oh, what does this company care about? It says it in their like 300-page 10K if you care to read it. But
it's at the glorified admin assistant level. Like it can parse things for you. I wouldn't have it create, an 800-word essay that the whole industry would share, because it can't really do that. But it can make time-consuming tasks quicker at this point.
It's also super cheesy. So if you ask it like, hey, make this a blog post, and you give it a bunch of information, or make this a LinkedIn post, I've noticed, especially if you say, make this information into a LinkedIn post, it includes like a ton of emojis, like really weird vocab.
We can blame this on the rest of the marketing industry copy pasting, quote unquote, thought leadership to each other on their blogs. And, ChatGPT is just, trying to create the averaged version of that. So you can blame the peers of Chris and I for years of spamming the internet. Not us, but many of our peers.
Give me their emails. I'll let them know.
Google should have named Bard Chat and just made it all thread posts. That would have done it for me.
So Rachel, you help venture capitalists and investors tell their story to the world, right? And create meaningful, however that content manifests, I guess, whether it's video or podcast or text or whatnot. I have a question. Should every investor or venture capitalist even share ideas online? Like when do you think it makes sense to, and for what type of investor? Probably it might not be the greatest idea, because I certainly see examples where I'm like, should they be saying this? Is this the best optics for them?
Yeah. So for VCs in particular, with podcasts, I don't think for one, I'm not a growth hacker. I'm not saying like, okay, I can teach you guys how to become the next Mr. Beast. A lot of the times when VCs want to create podcasts, they're focused on a really specific audience. So maybe that's getting more LPs. More often than not, it is to send to people that are interested in having that VC invest in their companies, so startup founders. And I do think it's really helpful for VCs to create, maybe it's like a 5-episode series, or this also could be a blog post, like 5 paragraphs about what they invest in, who the partners are, what their origins are, what is their value add, if that's something that they find they want to share, to send to startups in their portfolio, or startups that are interested in receiving capital, right? But I think the place that it gets a little bit murky is when anybody who's a capital allocator thinks that they also want to create content in the thought leadership space. And we're really just seeing a huge influx of people kind of swarming to this, whether that be on Twitter or podcasts, right? Anywhere where people will listen or read their thoughts. And that's where I advise everybody, not even just VCs, to be like, is this really a space that you think you're adding a ton of value in? Or is this something that in the long run isn't going to make you stand out, and it's going to be a ton of time that you put in on your end that is not going to serve you well?
It seems to me like there's really 2 motivations behind venture capitalists and investors sharing ideas online. And one of them is deal flow, and then one of them is ego. And I think the problem is when these guys, it's clearly an ego play, like it just becomes cringe, right? It becomes things that VC brags will share on Twitter. I don't know if you follow that handle.
Yes,
but
I do.
I think like for a lot of these guys, they've had so much success, and no one's ever told them, well, wait, maybe you shouldn't say that thing. And so they get into situations where, they're basically putting their full ego on display. And ultimately, I think that could harm deal flow, right? Like, why do you want to work with people where it's like, they're not just interested in the company and the idea? It's like, all about them and they want to, be up there ringing the bell if the company goes public versus, actually being there on the journey, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you see podcasts where I also think there's a huge difference between having a VC that is also someone who's an entertainer and a creator versus a VC that's just trying to boost their ego. So you see with the All In podcast, that's entertainment. So they don't really mention their funds that much. They are at this point like creators themselves. They're entertainers themselves. They're obviously not doing this. This isn't in relation to their funds at this point. So I also think VCs should focus on, am I trying to create a whole nother career in entertainment? Which I think a lot of people have tried to create podcasts kind of maybe based on All In or similar shows like that, where it's more of like a talk show. It's like, okay, if you're not providing too much value into the VC space or about your fund, into your investing thoughts, are you trying to become an entertainer? And then with that, like you said, is that going to hurt your deal flow at the end of the day? Because this is a public persona that you're putting online.
Totally. Can you share your funnest or just most interesting story of working with Jason? Have you ever sat down and beaten him in poker? Do you have like a offbeat story that's like kind of cool you could share with our listeners?
There is one thing, I think when I first joined, he was like giving me a grade on my podcast that I had before I joined the team, which was called Braun and Brains, which is actually how I got my job. So Braun and Brains is the name of my company now. And it was the name of my first podcast before I joined the show. And I started in college because obviously I was all over the place. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, except for I knew I didn't want to code. And I would have people on the podcast like Kat Cole came on, Dick Vermeil, who was the coach for the Eagles, which was pretty cool a long time ago. And I just had them explain like their jobs. And before I joined, somebody I think replied to one of Jason's tweets where he was like looking for another producer. And they said, oh, I listened to this girl's podcast, or I know this girl, she would be interesting. So that's kind of what led me to like working at This Week in Startup. So shout out to Twitter. But when I came on the team, Jason said, listen, your podcast is like kind of like a C. Like you need a lot of improvement. Like it was good, but like you need a ton of improvement. And he said this on a live stream. Like this wasn't like a one-on-one. Jason just doesn't really do one-on-one conversations. Like if you want to hear people get roasted, it's definitely before he goes live, which was really fun, honestly. And right before I left, not right before, but within my last few months, he told me that my kind of has gotten a lot better and meant a lot to me, because I remember way back when he said, listen, like you need to button some stuff up. And it meant so much to me that I screen recorded it on my phone after we talked, and it was on the live stream. And in his comment to me, he was like, your mom should be really proud. And I sent it to my mom. And her response was, wait, like, didn't he say that, like, aren't you like not that great at this? Like, didn't he say like 2-3 years ago that you weren't killing it at podcasting? I'm like, Mom, come on. But so I always think that's really funny. My mom's response was like, I don't know.
I like that story. And yeah, I think as if you're going to share ideas online, whether you're, an employed person who's, representing your company, or you're an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist, you have to be comfortable taking feedback, right? Definitely. Some people are going to love you from day one. Some people have a certain aesthetic in mind that, everything has to adhere to. And I think one thing not discussed is the fact that that's hard. Right? Like if you're a celebrity in Hollywood, you're like trained to get that kind of feedback. They tell you there are going to be people who hate you, even if you produce, this Grammy award-winning thing, versus I think if you're just sharing online, I think a reason a lot of people, there's definitely like a lot of people who don't deal well with that sort of feedback. And you see it manifest with a recent sad example is, the original mom blogger, who, she was the deuced lady. She was the one who had like the first mom blog. She just committed suicide, right? Really sad. And to go to that extreme to share, if you are sharing ideas online, and I think young people are better positioned here because you sort of get it. You've been on the internet your whole life, so you have this immunity naturally built up. You don't take it super seriously. And so you were able to take Jason's feedback and be like, oh, okay, maybe this is valid and I could use this to improve versus, oh, this is like a personal attack on me. I'm going to be existentially depressed about it. Because there's two ways that can go, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So first off, that is horrible. What happened with that creator, I can't even imagine. And I don't know if it's necessarily young people perform better receiving constructive criticism or criticism overall, actually, because nobody was meant like to get this much criticism with the world online, right? Definitely, you're completely correct. And young people are probably more used to it at this point. But I don't know if it doesn't make it as bad. But I do think there's a type of person that can take criticism in a different way. So the criticism that I would get from a previous employer is probably a lot different than the criticism like a mommy blogger gets online, right? When I started joining or coming on to the show, I got a ton of hate mostly into my Twitter DMs, right? Like just messages on a segment that I did called Okay Boomer. And it wasn't that bad because when I was in college and I started my podcast, that was already really freaking weird. So people would already tell me, like, not even in a comment, like to my face, like, dude, like I'd go to a bar and they'd be like, what are you doing? Like, that's really weird. Like, why would you make a YouTube channel at least? Like, who does podcasting? Because it was 2019. I don't think that many people were doing podcasts from their college apartments, talking about like career aspirations at the time. So luckily I already had like a little bit of like a taste of it. And at the end of the day, I had to be like, you know what, if you're not paying me, like, I don't really care. Like if this isn't my paychecks and I'm not putting something out there that's hurting anybody else, if I'm giving my own opinion online, that's like true to who I am. I was really proud of the OK Boomer segment, which is a part on This Week in Startups, where I would talk to Gen Z founders and people would, thank you. I really liked it. I was really happy to promote, first-time founders, young investors, creators came on as well. But at the end of the day, if other people didn't like it, it didn't really concern them. My boss was paying me. I got, every week, hundreds of thousands of people got to listen to me podcast, which I couldn't even imagine when I was in college, just starting out, like that anybody would listen. I remember when I got 1,000 subscribers or 1,000 listens on one of my episodes, I freaked out in college. Like I was waiting for this. If you don't like it, that is totally okay.
I got a question for you, Rachel. So you started off as a producer and then made your way as on-air contributor. I think that's what they're called. You're doing the news segments, chiming in on people's earnings or companies' earnings reports and such. What was that transition like? Did you find that difficult?
So there was actually like 3 transitions. So I was actually hired on doing podcast operations, and within the first few weeks, that changed to just doing. Actually, I think it might have been called producer operations. Operations was in there, but pretty quickly I just switched over to a full producer role because, like I said, small team, all hands on deck. And when Jason asked me to come on the show, Nick, I believe, was the one who kind of talked to me first a little bit and like, hey, just a heads up. We've been thinking this might be a cool thing to do. And I was so nervous the first few episodes because not only did I not have a ton of one-on-one time, just speaking with Jason, but at the time we were also live recording everything. So you can see the comments as you're talking come up on the screen. And I wasn't doing my, what are those called? I wasn't doing my interviews with other Gen Zs, right? On a live stream, but I was getting Jason's feedback on the live. And a lot of times Jason wouldn't have listened to the episode before we hashed out what I spoke about. He was really just taking in like my thoughts on how the episode went. And that was always really nerve-wracking for me. But as time went on, I got a lot more comfortable with Jason and speaking on a live stream. But I think the hardest transition was definitely seeing the comments in real time. And thankfully, during the live streams, nobody was necessarily mean or anything. But people would definitely be like, oh, you got this person on. Why wouldn't you get this person on? Or, oh, this isn't a segment that I really want to listen to today. I'll probably skip, and things like being honest, like, but it wasn't mean, but it was like, oh, okay. So that was a little bit of a transition.
It can throw you off your vibe.
Yeah, don't, I'm OG internet nerd. I've been online since the forum days, and nothing anyone online says can ever bother me. And I think anyone who says something that's like a jerk thing, that person has some personal problems, and I wouldn't ever let it get to you. People are crazy, and you'll be so much happier to just immunize yourself to it. You said something that was super interesting, Rachel, and I think this is a common trend. If you're a young person listening to this, Rachel, just like the Morning Brew guys, started her craft and career in college. She didn't wait for the piece of paper to said, oh, you are blessed to go out into the world. She's like, no, I'm just going to start doing things. And I think if you do that and had that approach, you're like already ahead of everyone else from like a competency standpoint. And I think that's probably been something that's shortcutted not just Rachel, but many other people's careers or entrepreneurship, because they sort of realize, well, you don't have to wait for permission. And I think that's one thing when I talk to a lot of young people, or when I hire, young people for my teams, that's like a really common thing is I don't want them to wait for permission. I want them to just do things and be self-starters. And once you can get that as part of your personality, I think like there's like outsized rewards for that in modernity. You are just rewarded for trying stuff with the right management. If you're at like, an IBM or a Microsoft, maybe not so much, but if you're at a startup or you're at a small business, like your bias should just be to ship and do things. And if you're with a team that punishes you for that, then that's a bad team. You should find a new one.
I remember when we were getting started, I was a wreck every single episode. Like my palms are sweaty. I was like, I can't believe I'm recording myself putting this on the internet. This is fucking insane. And thank you, Adam, for making it.
It's fine. Everything is just reps online anyway. I built and sold a marketing blog many years ago, one of the first digital marketing blogs, and I was blogging to my mother and my cat for like the first number of years, and then all of a sudden I have like 50,000 visitors a month, and everything is just reps. Everything. So even like creative things that what you don't see with the iconoclast musician or filmmaker is the fact that they just spent like an absurd amount of time working on refining what they do. Like, yeah, you have some natural gifts, IQ, creativity, upbringing, whatever, but most of it is just reps. Doesn't matter what it is. And if you put in more reps, you're just going to, be better than all of the people who weren't willing to sacrifice and do that.
Right. It's like practicing. It's like you always see people that are extremely creative in their final work, but you're not going to practice with them. You're not seeing all these crazy musicians, practice all their childhoods, I'm sure, like full of just hours and hours of, like you said, repetition. That's where that first question that you asked me in the beginning of the pod comes into play, where like their creativity is great. And creativity is definitely something that drives me, but consistently is a huge component to putting yourself out there.
I see. And I actually find it really interesting when I discover a new creative person, whether they're like a vlogger or a musician, and they're just publishing their first works, because in a lot of cases, those works, they haven't like built up any calcification to their creativity. It's like very raw. And I think that sometimes those are the most interesting people and the most interesting things that they do. Yeah, it gets refined and polished later, but like to see like, if you go back and watch, Kevin Smith's movies, if you go back and watch Clerks, I think Clerks is one of his best movies. And it's because he had no budget. He had to just focus on the dialogue and, the set and the characters. And yes, he's done obviously much more polished things to this day, but like his early work was so cool. Like
right.
and it was sort of, he hadn't had other people. You were talking about getting feedback from like a Jason, but if you were to listen to too much feedback from other people, you would now become this, average. We're talking about ChatGPT. You're getting an averaged output versus like the output that is you. So I think like if you can retain a little bit of your, your identity, yourself, because the one thing that can't be copied is like Rachel's experience or Chris's experience to this day. Like you can't copy that. So just don't let the world, if you're, we have a lot of advertisers listening to this, and with a previous podcast with a fellow Isaac Simpson, who he's an ex big agency guy who started a small shop. He made the point to note that committees kill creativity, and all the iconoclast creative that you see, whether it's an ad or a movie, is from, this auteur who decided, no, I've got this vision for things and this is how I'm going to run with it. So there is a risk to listening to too much feedback. I think you sort of learn, and as you go forward, like you were mentioning, Rachel, you see like what gets views or what gets shares. And in one of your previous podcasts, I like that, you take an approach to marketing that all of the marketing industry was conditioned not to do. So you had said, I try a whole bunch of social posts. I see the ones that work, and then I make more like that. Great. So that's a data-driven approach. Marketers classically were taught to not do that, to do a bunch of focus groups, to put out a bunch of stuff and be like, I know what's best. And I don't think in an internet publishing scenario. So it's interesting how you've approached your career, which is not necessarily how a lot of other people were trained. So I was saying that long-winded spiel, don't lose your own, like the things that you've done that you found have worked for you, because they might be uniquely valuable.
Awesome. Thank you. And you said that way more eloquently, and I like to just call it, you throw crap at the wall and see what sticks. Is the method there?
Yeah, and the cost to publish online is $0, right? So why would you not just share more? We have more structured questions. You're just so interesting, Rachel. We just wanted to start out with a conversation with you. Chris, you want to ask some from our list? We did some research here.
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity to jump into why this is all happening, right? So why do professionals like Rachel exist? And I think it's like people are tired of like this like boomerized media. It's all packaged up. Every episode is the same, and so you're starting to see fragmentation, and you're starting to see a lot of trends in the media space. And I was hoping maybe you can shed some light on something beyond what I would say, which is like obviously the rise of streaming. We're seeing a lot of fragmentation in the space, getting very personalized, super niche topics, and obviously, like Adam had mentioned, the distribution cost. I mean, part of the reason why we do this is like the cost of distributing this is zero. So what are you seeing in the media space? Why now? Where do you think this is going to go? And we can talk about that forever, but let's maybe focus on the first one first.
So I think where the media space is going is a great question, because I think there are a lot more industries realizing how important media is that these industries never really focused on before, right? So even venture capital, if you think about it, is a fairly new concept. I can't give you the exact date, but it's something that isn't incredibly new, these like standard VCs that we see. And going in and being able to produce media for them is even newer, right? So I'm not walking around town every single day and seeing a bunch of ads from like venture capitalists right now. And the more and more that I create content for VCs, the more and more I realize, wow, there's so much more of a place for these industries to kind of pop in, right? So, and this goes the same with startups. So initially, I'm sure you guys know, like advertising used to be incredibly expensive. These small niche industries weren't going to do things like spend money to put an ad up on a billboard. But now that the cost to post something is $0, or if you want to do paid media, it can be even cents. You're seeing these industries really adopt the media space more and more. And I kind of wonder, what will the next wave of media and marketing be as we're becoming a obviously chronically online culture, but it's like we have to constantly be looking for the next thing. And I wonder for small businesses, for smaller funds, where that's going to be. Because right now we do hear a lot of VCs create their own content as a form of marketing. But one day will I listen to a podcast about VC and tech and hear a specific fund be within that 30-minute advertising segment? So far, I haven't ever heard that, but we might in the future. And I think things are changing so freaking fast that if you're not looking towards the future and you're just looking like, okay, what can we do with what we have right now? You're probably going to be left behind a little bit.
So what are your thoughts on, so there's this camp that does like these short snackable pieces of content for your TikToks, your Twitters, so on and so forth. But I think a lot of the value from like a B2B perspective is going to be in the long form podcasts and media like that. Are you seeing adoption of like, are you seeing the migration of a lot of like these business topics, maybe moving from like a CNBC, MSNBC to more so to, podcasts on like a YouTube, for example?
So B2B is a really interesting space, but I actually see, so for anybody who you're doing marketing with, you're kind of thinking like, who is the endpoint, right? B2B, obviously, it's other businesses. So I've actually seen more people use LinkedIn and their advertising tools than I even have over on podcasts. And there are some podcasts that are incredible and that focus on the B2B space. And they have good advertising spots, but there aren't as many people listening to B2B podcasts as there are scrolling on LinkedIn. So when it comes to content in that sense, I actually think LinkedIn is it. I never thought I'd say that. I'm not on LinkedIn very often. I'm rarely on it. But I've been doing a ton of copywriting over there, and the posts are doing really well. Whereas with podcasts, it's a little bit more inconsistent that I've noticed. So, for example, if an advertiser is placing an ad at the very end of a podcast, so if there's if there's 3 ads in an episode, and your ad spot is the last place, and you're a B2B company, the chances of your ad being listened to, even if the episode goes semi-viral, is pretty low, because that means the person has to be listening all the way to the third ad. Whereas with LinkedIn, I find it's a little bit easier to track. You know who's scrolling on LinkedIn, and just being able to have that link straight to the person's page or their website is really nice. And we see companies like Spotify kind of trying to disrupt this space. So with Spotify's new ad platform for, I believe it's only Spotify, either Spotify Original or Spotify partnership podcasts do this. But with an ad that pops up, like a HelloFresh ad halfway through an episode, you can actually click right when you're listening to the podcast and you jump to the page. But that's relatively new. And not everybody is listening to their podcast over on Spotify. And to find that link is a lot harder. And even if you're reading it out loud to somebody, I don't know how many times I've honestly even gone to a podcast link that's been read out loud, or like one that hasn't been a pop-up. So I'm taking a bet on LinkedIn for B2B.
By the way, Chris, Rachel said, and I quote, B2B is so interesting. So we are winning with our promotion of B2B when people we have on the podcast say B2B is interesting. Because I remember early in my marketing career, there like no one under 40 would ever say B2B is interesting, and now people say B2B is interesting. It's so exciting.
I definitely think B2B is interesting, especially because of just the scale you're working at and the problems that the products are trying to solve. So that first fund that I worked at, Dynamo, focuses on supply chain and mobility. There are not D2C supply chain and mobility companies that I was looking at when I was there. So
B2B is cool because you're literally powering the world. And the thing is you don't find that exciting unless you're like a nerd. And I just think we just have more nerds in the marketing seat these days that, maybe because they're actually using software to run their ads, or maybe it's just like all of the interfaces are more user-friendly. So, it's very much, every business function has cool dashboards to use and things like that. And now people have become interested in it. Because I remember in the 2000s, it was basically like pulling teeth to even get your team to use software, right? Like no one wanted to, unless you were sort of forced to, or it was like it made your job a lot easier. Almost no one wanted to use a lot of the CRM tools or anything. You have to like sort of whip your sales team to record sales on the right thing, right? And of course, not whipping anyone. I mean, metaphorically. But yeah, it's definitely. I think what's happened is the enterprises realized we're not going to retain people who hate their life. Like we want them to have software that they like to use, that they find joy in. And I think like consumer software getting so good has sort of been the dog wagging the tail of all the enterprise software. So
that's a good note on that.
I think the best part about what we do is this new trend of parroting everything. parodying everything on LinkedIn. So shit posting, for other words.
We need to have Jack on the podcast.
We need to get
He's
Jack,
like the master
Jack
shit
and
poster.
Alex.
Really need Jack. Jack is a friend of mine. So funny in real life. He's super funny. Him and Dan Toomey, who is the Morning Brew content creator, he's one of the creators, at Morning Brew. I also believe Macy was in the video, who's also a creator over at Morning Brew, put out a video on their YouTube shit posting about LinkedIn. And it was so good. I think he created a new one a few days ago as well.
See, I agree with you. LinkedIn is great for targeting. Like you can do cool ad targeting. Like I can say, I just want to target, HR directors at law firms in the Midwest. And that's like pretty cool. You can do that. But from like an organic content perspective, if you see me browsing LinkedIn, that's like a duress signal. Clearly I'm in trouble and please send help, because my problem with it is it's like, I don't know about your feeds, but it's just so self-promotional. It's like less people sharing ideas and more of their company announcements. So for me, it's kind of like, it's fine. I'll go in and see what all my friends are shipping at their job. But like, if I want to see where industry is going, I'll go on, Twitter, or I'll listen to some podcasts, or I'll read Substack, because there's not this like personal ego / personal brand bias. It's more sharing around ideas. And of course I'm stereotyping. That's not just everyone, but that's like the aggregate of what I see on LinkedIn.
No, I think you're right. And I also think advertisers should focus on social media, not as a way of where people are communicating, but actually as a place where people are searching. So the amount of times that I've gone on, say, TikTok and been like best restaurants in New York City that serve mocktails is pretty high. Like I'm starting to use social media as a search function over just traditional Google search. And I think from like an ad perspective, you got to think, okay, where are people going to be searching for solutions for your field? So maybe that is Twitter. If you're looking for something that's like ad tech, software, something like that, Twitter can totally be somewhere where people are searching questions and using that to find answers rather than, like I said, traditional Safari or Google search.
Have you seen, it's so interesting, the TikTok queries for like finding a restaurant or something. I think that it actually makes sense, because like I've found like better like YouTube videos when I'm like traveling somewhere than just searching in regular search, like someone who actually took the time to like explore a different area. So it does make sense, even though it's a little weird to like, boomers who are like, wait, what? Am I watching like an interpretive dance of someone finding a restaurant? But one thing with TikTok and Instagram videos that I've seen that's interesting, I don't know if you have a take on this, but the notion of like over tourism, where like these spots become these sort of influencer hotspots where people go to. I think it's fine with like a specific restaurant, but sometimes in like these tourist destinations, you see like the locals are like, I hate all these people that are here for their stupid selfie. And so I don't know if you have a take on that. Is it like still net good for those businesses? Is there a balance? Should people behave better?
Well, I think so. I always say, I think I tweeted this. It's so sad, the day that my favorite wine bar got outed on TikTok, and I'll let everybody here know what it is, because it has already been outed on TikTok. It's Sky in the Lower East Side. It is wonderful. I believe it's on Clinton Street. Sky Cafe, or Cafe Sky. Wonderful place. Outed on TikTok. And what I noticed wasn't the fact, obviously they liked getting the business, but it was the aftermath, right? So when you're putting these businesses on blast, they're also becoming part of the trend cycle. And we're seeing this with women's fashion, where the cycles of trends, obviously trend cycle, it's moving faster than ever. So one outfit that I wore 2 months ago, I might look at now and be like, oh my gosh, what the heck was I thinking? And the same thing is happening with these restaurants and other businesses. And that is really difficult. So it's like getting love bombed from a business perspective, where you have a bunch of tourists that is really difficult to kind of handle, because you've never dealt with like this influx of people before. And then 2 months later, there's something else that's like the new thing on the block, and you have to kind of recoup a lot quicker. And we kind of saw this like happen with the supply chain during the pandemic, right? Where certain companies selling things were just bombarded. And then when they finally got their shipments in, they finally had enough stock to fulfill a bunch of orders. They found themselves continuously buying that stock, and now they have a bunch of stuff, or they did have a bunch of stuff left over, and they were like, how are we going to get rid of it? And think of that from a business perspective, like a restaurant down the street or a tourist attraction, right? Maybe they build out a bunch of things within that tourist attraction to kind of keep up with the demand, but next month the demand is so much lower, and they put all this time and effort into altering this location, and not for nothing, because I'm sure it would serve a purpose for a short period of time, but it is really difficult for businesses now. And from a consumer perspective, it's kind of like you can't blame them, because they're just trying to find something to do or something to go eat. And like I said, they're using these search functions or they're using these social media pages as places to search new places to go. So it's not all on the consumer, and it must be really difficult for the business. And I think that I don't want to say that gatekeeping is good or anything like that, but people are realizing more and more how much of their life can become content. And that's something that we either need to learn how to adapt to, or maybe we need to figure out how to make a plan that these businesses can still survive when they're not the hottest thing.
It's really interesting when you put it out like that. That was actually, when you were talking, it reminded me of, you might be too young, back in the dig days of the internet. If your blog or your site or whatever became popular, you would all at once get, 1 million visits to your content, to your site. And what you would see is most of that traffic would bounce. You would come once, it would be there. It was like the goldfish traffic of the internet. And they didn't want what was on your site. They wanted the next thing. So they would click back and keep going to the next thing. And so that was like one of the original social media formats. And I wonder if you are like a business of any sort, if you are going to get this goldfish traffic, I guess there's two questions. One, what could you do to have some of that traffic be long-term retention traffic from a health perspective? You mentioned having lower demand the week after, probably an inevitability, but you want to capture some of that ongoing. And then I guess the second question is, how do you plan to build out for that? Like maybe there's some predictive, modeling software you could use where if you're a D2C company, you could, get an alert that, hey, way more traffic than usual from X source. You can predict, maybe they can try and guess, inventory demand, and you can sort of try and plan. It's so interesting what you said though, because I don't think there's much of a playbook for it right now.
Mm-hmm.
And some people really leaned into it too, like Peloton. I mean, like they thought the pandemic wouldn't end and just kept on building, the
Exactly.
bikes and the treadmills and everything else. And it's like, oh, well, this ended. So I guess people are going to go back to.
I have a bone to pick with Peloton, by the way. So we bought one because my wife uses it all the time. And I'm like, well, she bought one. I might as well. You have to get the shoes to use it. So the first time I tried to use it, I didn't know you needed the special Peloton shoes. So I tried to get on. I'm like, I can't do anything here. So then I bought the shoes and I went on it like twice. And then I haven't gone back, but I've started going to the gym again. So I wanted to go on it, and you'll love this. I couldn't log in to like a $2,000 device that I bought because I hadn't used it in so long. Like I couldn't remember my password, and I couldn't figure out on the login screen how to like just use it one time. So I just gave up and I just went for a jog with my dogs instead. But like that whole experience, like sitting on my hands, not to tweet snark at them, but like I feel like they don't think through their own product too much, which is like a whole different animal. But sorry to yell about Peloton. It's like your own device should have one click. I don't need to go into a class with someone yelling at me. I just want like a timer. Tell me how far I'm going, right?
Yeah, but I think the one thing that go ahead.
Sorry.
I was
That's
gonna say,
possible for the user.
I think the one thing that we could take away from like this kind of like this hype cycle is like, the businesses that do have a quality product will stand around. I mean, like I remember last decade, living in San Francisco, Anthony Bourdain came to like Swan Oyster Depot, which was like a couple blocks away from me. And then obviously line out the door for like the next year. And I don't think that ever went away, except maybe recently due to the crime and all that stuff that's happening over there. But, they had a great business. Anthony brought it to the forefront, rest in peace. And everybody was going there, like going ham on it, and miss it dearly.
I think it's such a fit for him, but then you see other brands like try to borrow celebrity where it doesn't make sense. And I think it works against that brand and the celebrity. The obvious example is like all of like Matt Damon shilling crypto.com, right? It was like, what is he doing? And not good for Matt. Crypto.com is sort of dying on the vine right now. So I think the notion of celebrity, people want to use celebrity to create what happens organically now via social. And I think it's like sometimes you can't create the magic of something like that. Maybe with the right fit, maybe with Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace. But I think that's an underrated, hard thing to do. Like, and Rachel was talking about, well, do you even want that? Right? Like there could be drawbacks if you're not planned for it. So it's like the notion of going viral online. Like you can't snap your fingers and go viral, right? You can't make your product viral. You can put ad dollars behind it and expect, X in business back from Y spend, but you can't like make your company suddenly have a queue out the door for cupcakes. But cupcakes might be good. So.
Yeah, I think like this morning, Nikita Beer had a tweet where it's like, yeah, you could spend this money on an influencer. I think it was Nikita. It was like, like if you have a D2C product and you spend like $50K on an influencer, odds are, another brand can pay another influencer 50 grand and the outcome is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So lots to navigate in this new world, especially for us old people.
Rachel, I'd like to ask a question in terms of, because you've spent a while analyzing this. I tend to think the notion of celebrity matters less in a world where I can ask like my friends something, or I can ask like the definitive expert at blank something versus hearing what, Oprah or hearing what whoever has an opinion on something where they were just paid dollars. I feel like people, especially like tech savvy people, are smart enough to see through this. We're more media literate than ever. And so I tend to see like, I guess the notion of micro influence matter more. I don't know if you've seen this as well.
So I think there's like a twofold thing happening here. One, we're seeing people become famous a lot quicker. So Brooke Shields kind of talked about this in her documentary. This isn't my original thought, but way back in the day, right? We had these celebrities and everybody knew who they were and everybody else was just regular people. Nowadays, somebody can have like 5 million followers over on Instagram and I won't even know who they are. So I think there are just more people who are, whether they're influencers or celebrity, they have status. So there's more of these people with this social status that we weren't really used to previously, right? Another thing is now that we've become used to this, we have like distrust towards status because I'm not saying it's a lot easier, but it does feel like it's a little bit more obtainable to get that status. And so the person promoting these products or the person promoting a website or whatever it is, you can kind of take it with a grain of salt, being like, okay, this person is just like me. Because in the back of your brain, it's only between you and one viral TikTok getting you maybe to that same place. So these people, their jobs are, I like to kind of relate to them to people at like the makeup counters. Way back in the day, I was watching Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and she worked at like a lipstick counter, right? And she was selling makeup at this lipstick counter. And I kind of thought to myself, like, okay, these are similar people to influencers today, because that's how these influencers and these people with that status are making money. They're selling you a product, right? So this is their job. It's not making them like a bad person or anything because like they're being salesy. That is literally their job. And now there's even more of them, right? And so you're becoming less trustworthy or becoming somebody that is not as trusting of these people makes a lot of sense because you are constantly being fed these ads because there are more and more people coming into this profession. So having somebody that is a micro influencer that does feel like in the scale of having that social status is a little bit maybe closer to you makes it a little bit more believable, because you could say, okay, this person that I see, maybe they're like a professional, a teacher as their main profession, right? This person's a teacher and she has like a Crayola ad because she has this other profession as a teacher. This is a lot more believable. And this is something that like I can relate to a lot more than maybe the Kardashians promoting Crayola or something like that.
Yeah, the Hollywood must hate this because the internet makes attention this raw, ruthless capitalist thing where, you know, they don't want you to be able to grind for attention. They want you to be chosen by like a Harvey Weinstein type person, which that's how they operate. They don't want a level playing field. It's not a meritocracy. It's the people that they crown and they can have as part of their, you know, consumer industrial complex, like the Kardashians, to sell you, you know, the thing that they want to sell through their media that they control, which I think that's a lot of why you see Hollywood manifest all of these tech dystopian narratives, is because tech is sort of trying to drink their milkshake a little bit in terms of taking over their channels of distribution. I think the reason we can talk about this now is I think they lost. I think like the cat is out of the bag. You can say whatever you want now. They are also Lindy Man. I don't know if you follow Lindy Man on Twitter. He talks about this a lot. There's no more age of celeb anymore because of what you said, where there's someone with 5 million YouTube subscribers or 5 million Instagram followers or whatever that you know, wasn't chosen by the media, but they have their own amount of power in the world or influence in the world because they built that. And so there's too many of them for everyone to know and follow all of these people. So it's a whole new dynamic, at least when it comes to attention. And so you're a researcher. I think that if you're a marketer, you need to think through from first principles what this means for your brand, because it might not make sense to pay for the $10 million sponsorship of one person. It might make sense to sponsor 1,000 people instead. And so these are like tests you could run at your company, which I think a lot of marketers are doing already and seeing what works for them. So I think it's an interesting time to be an advertiser because the VR industry hasn't really changed in 120 years. It's been pretty much the same, and all of a sudden it's not the same. And we're only now seeing budgets really start to move. Like, it's surprising to me it's taken this long. You know, right now there's something like $65 billion still going to linear TV, which is like an absurd amount of money to reach, you know, people watching Animal Planet at 2 p.m. You wouldn't believe how much that media slot costs, and that money could be going to creators online, actually reaching people. So I think we're at an interesting time starting now. Everyone's like, oh, you know, the internet's mature. I'm like, no, the internet's just starting. You guys like haven't really seen anything yet.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned like TV ads, because it was just announced not that long ago. The Wall Street Journal had like this great piece about why Duolingo has replaced a ton of TV ads with its free TikTok posts. And if anybody's listening and interested, I highly recommend checking it out, because very interesting piece. Obviously, TikTok blew up for Duolingo in particular. TikTok's I'm trying to remember her name, the girl that was the mascot for Duolingo, right? It was this girl probably around my age, like some 20-something in a bird costume. And it just completely went wild for them over on TikTok. And how much money did it cost for her to get in that bird costume versus how much money did it cost for TV ads to be run? And then on that, you know, same note, what are the returns? Because I also think, and I'm not sure, this isn't something that I've necessarily looked into a lot, but as time goes on, what are the returns right now for influencer marketing? I think a lot of times people jump to do micro influencer marketing or influencer marketing pretty quickly. And it's, I'd be interested to see what, how many new customers people are actually getting from that still.
Yeah, the attribution problem on that is word of mouth. So it's unsolvable unless you can get into people's brains. You can do some things from a measurement standpoint, but it's a lot of it is, as we like to say in the analytics industry, faith-based, and it's okay to have some allocation of faith-based tactics. You can get a sense for if they're working. And a question that I ask everyone on this podcast and related to advertising is, do you pay for cable TV?
I don't. I use my dad's login to Verizon to get things like NBC on my Roku. So
Yep.
I do not,
So,
but I do
so
use the login.
100% of people under 40 do not pay for TV that we talk to, which is super bearish because we're all in the technology and media industry. So it's like it's all pharma ads for people who are sitting at home all day.
Guess what ad? I was watching the nightly news with Lester Holt, which is basically why I use my dad's login to get Verizon. It was Ozempic was one of the ads, and I was like, whoa. Like over on Twitter, we're seeing all this discourse about Ozempic, which is a diabetes drug that people are using for weight loss right now, and misusing, according to a lot of other people on Twitter. And seeing an ad for it in plain sight was so interesting to me.
I have one more question, then Chris can ask one. In terms of your age cohort, so I think you're like a decade younger than us, but we won't talk about age-specific numbers. That's okay. What's your sense of like just the culture wars in terms of your age group and what people are thinking? Is everyone tired of them? Are you guys feisty and riled up to be on one side? Where does that stand?
For what do you mean on cultural borders?
The culture wars. So like the whole political wars that have invaded everything.
Okay, so I think we can focus on like these like political wars in terms of technology, right? So let's just focus on like that as a very, very narrow point.
Sure.
I think there's a lot more skepticism in the generation above me, and not as much, although I do have peers that tend to be more skeptical than some in my generation, the generation below me, which is Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And that's because I noticed this really interesting thing where we were, although I was pretty young by the time technology was incorporated into my life, I wasn't necessarily born with an iPad at my hands, right? Like my little sister was, who's 6 years younger than me. With millennials, people went from not having iPhones in the class, right, in their classrooms day to day, to this like rapid expansion to all this technology around us today. So I feel like the generation above me can kind of have a more critical eye when it comes to emerging technology than my generation and the generation below me, because they've been able to see this rapid change and maybe more impacts that have happened throughout their life. So my sister probably doesn't even imagine a day when my mom didn't have an iPhone. So there's so many photos of my little sister, right, compared to when I was a lot younger. So obviously I had a lot of pictures of me as a kid. My mom took a lot on like a digital camera, but you can't say like the technological adoption once iPhones, for example, came into play wasn't insane. And I think because millennials were really able to be like, okay, we have literally gone through this crazy transition. They're able to look at things and be a little bit more hesitant, whereas Gen Z is kind of doesn't really care as much. And maybe doesn't really care isn't the wrong term, but they don't really mind having things like their data. Maybe they do mind that their data is being looked at, but maybe they aren't taking as many precautions, for example, as millennials would.
That's super interesting for marketers to hear, because that actually runs counter to what a lot of older marketers say about young people. So that was really interesting.
I think young people care, because I think that's what people think, like, oh, young people care so much. I do think they care, but I don't think they're doing as much about it as millennials would. So, for example, I don't have downloaded like one of those virus blockers. I probably shouldn't say this. I don't have like a virus blocker on my laptop. Whereas like maybe my millennial counterparts, for example, would be doing a little bit more to safeguard things like that.
Also, my mother has a clamshell phone, and she has no like internet like anxiety or FOMO or anything like that. So that's another way to do things. I think like the old enough boomers like never even bothered to get a smartphone.
I totally agree.
They might be better for it.
My dad has one because of work. He would not have one. My dad's I believe he's a boomer. He would not have one if it wasn't for work.
I did install. I did set up streaming for my mother though, because she likes to stream like Seinfeld and stuff. So yeah. Although I'm known as the tech savvy one in my family, which isn't good because I get phone calls for just basic IT questions from everyone in my family. I'm like, I'm not in IT. They don't know the difference between like working in software and IT. It's all IT. So
I love it.
Cool. Well, I think we're coming up on an hour. We covered technology. We covered the short form versus long form. We covered the fact that the mall no longer exists, but the makeup counter does. I think the last thing that I would love to tie it back to is going back to the media and the marketing piece. And Rachel, given your success, what advice would you give marketing teams, maybe at startups, like ourselves, thinking about creating their own media arms for their business? How do you think about that? What steps would you take to get started?
I think a big piece of advice I have is you don't have to have every social media platform under your belt. So really focus on the audience that you're trying to find. The case scenarios that I've been seeing a lot lately have been these companies that have a social media presence on a bajillion different accounts, right? And it is so much easier to really figure out where your audience is. Maybe it's not even on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, whatever. Maybe it's on Reddit or something like that. Like really find your audience and then focus on there rather than trying to go wider. I'd like to see people go a little bit more deep.
That's great feedback. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us. But before we go, where can people find you? You're amazing. Where can people find you on the internet?
So on the internet, if you want to check out YouTube, I've been putting up some videos here and there. That's youtube.com/@_Rachel Braun. And my Twitter is the same username, @_Rachel Braun. And Braun is spelled BRAUN. So Braun and Brains, spelled BRAUN, Braun and Brains. So that's the company, and those are my usernames.
Awesome. We will throw some links in the episode description for those who are on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you got it spelled out by Rachel. But if you come back to the description page, we will give you links if that was too hard.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much for joining. And everyone, stay tuned for next week where we're going to have continued interesting guests from our sector. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.